with regards to the CRIRSCO, which is the overarching body or the glue that binds all of the different codes together. What can we do here with regards to the risk and uncertainty assessment? Ed, over to yourself.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing my screen all right. Okay, great. Okay, it's a bit strange getting used to this online conferences and so forth, where I'm having to worry about the lighting in my office rather than wearing a suit or tie. Those of you who heard me talk before may know that usually at conferences and training courses I bring along my mascot, so he wanted to put in a quick appearance here and just say he's ready to deal with all the awkward questions at the end. So I perhaps should have thought of a snazzier title for this, but listening to, going through the talk yesterday, I thought, well, actually including 3 issues or touching on 3 issues that have come up in several of the talks that I've been listening to, and I sort of combined those in an alternative talk title there for those who aren't familiar with terms CRIRSCO and Table 1 and so forth. But also just from my perspective, I just say I would think of a responsible mining project as one that's properly planned and requires a proper assessment of relevant source of uncertainty. So I'm hopefully going to illustrate some practical tools in that regard in my talk. So for those who aren't familiar with the terms, let's just have a quick run through. CRIRSCO, this is an international group of professional organizations involved in setting codes and standards for reporting information on exploration results, mineral resources, and mineral reserves. That's particularly by companies involved in exploration and extraction of those solid minerals that are listed on stock exchanges. And for those who want to know a bit more about that, I'd refer you to the talk Ruth Allington gave yesterday, because she explained some of the concepts of that. But one very important benefit of CRIRSCO is that the codes adopted by the bodies indicated on the map, they all use common definitions for 16 key terms. And these are included in what's referred to as the CRIRSCO International Reporting Template. And again, this is obviously a bit of an insider thing, but if you're familiar with the template, you'll be familiar that one of the elements in the template is a Table 1 checklist, which I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk. Obviously, the third element of the talk is risk and uncertainty assessment. Here I'll again touch on the terminologies and what we mean by these, because what I realized in communication and listening to different people talk is we often all have different understandings of the words we use, and that's particularly true I think with risk and uncertainty. Well, risk, I think probably the general public, if you ask them, everyone tends to think of risk as something negative or to be avoided. But if you look at the ISO definition, it has a more general definition of the effect of uncertainty on the objectives. And because the two, I think, in people's mind are inextricably linked, I've now come to the habit I just talk about risk and uncertainty assessment rather than risk assessment, because I think you need to know about the uncertainties in order to sort of have an idea of where you may have risks. Then working as a resource geologist, I mean, uncertainty is something that one always takes into consideration. There was a blog recently by Chris Arnold who talked of resource geologists as professional reducers of uncertainty. But I'd say more we're assessors of uncertainty and try to communicate that to other people, to engineers and to management. And typically in our work, we have to balance costs and benefits of acquiring extra information against the level of detail that we require. And I think you kind of see this at the moment in terms of the health industry, where they're talking about testing and all. You know, how much testing do you do before you can rely on the results in order to make decisions? It's the same sort of issue with the mining industry, and you know that uncertainty is lack of knowledge, but you can never have perfect knowledge, even though often you mine something out. So it comes down to what's the cost of obtaining more information. Then assessing risk and uncertainty. Well, if you think of risk as being more the effect of uncertainty on objectives, then you can have positive or negative outcomes. And in that sense, the opposite of opportunity, I would see as threat rather than risk, and you have reward and penalty, benefit and cost. And yeah, for instance, if you're at the exploration stage, high uncertainty may mean there's lots of opportunities represented by interesting drilling targets which merit further investigation. Whereas on an operating mine, high uncertainty may mean that there's potential threats which could affect the health and safety of people and the surrounding environment. So what is Table 1? Well, Table 1's it's a checklist of assessment criteria. It was originally introduced in the JORC code in 1989, so it's been around for over 30 years. So if anyone's in the working in this area and doesn't know about it, well, I think you're a bit should be paying more attention to the codes and standards that you're supposed to be following. The latest version that I'll be referring to came in the CRIRSCO template, which was issued at the end of last year, and that includes over 150 items. I'm referring to each of these items as one of the rows in the table. So there are now over 150 items of general interest, and there are additional ones for specific commodities. And you note the text at the top says that Table 1 is a checklist that should be considered. But for myself personally, for the last 6 years, I've been using it in a different manner, really as a framework for assessing risks and uncertainties in the context of mineral resource and mineral reserves estimates. And I'm going to illustrate this in the next slide. So this is a portion, an extract from Table 1. That's the part that covers sampling techniques and data, which is namely to do with, what are the assay data? That's the measurements of the ore grades, how much percentage copper or how many grams per ton gold we have in a deposit, and what laboratories are we using and what confidence do we have in the laboratories. Personally, I think a lot of people just have got in the habit of using Table 1 just with a purely checklist mentality, and they then tend to forget why particular items have been included in the table. So what I found it very useful is adding some extra columns on the right, which are the potential source of risk and uncertainty and the measures used to assess those risk and uncertainty. And for instance, in the case of analytical results, source uncertainty might include, is the laboratory we're using, might be biased and unreliable. Well, then we couldn't rely on the results very well. Are the results reliable in terms of accuracy and precision? And then how can we manage those uncertainties? Well, we do things like we use independently certified laboratories. I suppose in a way we're then relying on some other organization to monitor the laboratory and the laboratory to have its own internal controls. We might send check samples to another umpire laboratory for independent checks. But what I feel is people have forgotten that when we report on the results obtained, we should always remember why those items are in the checklist. And I think if you go through the table, you'd find that 80 or 90% of the items in there you can link to a potential source of uncertainty that would affect your decision making. And I've been using this approach for several years to provide mineral resource contributions to project risk registers. Typically in these large mining projects, you have multidisciplinary teams, you have mining engineers, process engineers, you have people doing the environmental baseline studies and so forth. But using this type of approach, it helps communicate the geological concerns to the engineers and to mine managers and decision makers so that it can incorporate those uncertainties into the decision making. And in such situations where I'm using it in that way, then I add on extra columns which are for likelihood and consequence, which is a sort of fairly standard risk assessment approach, and the typical risk rating matrix where you multiply risk, likelihood and consequence of an event occurring to get an overall risk rating. And if you do a Google search, you'll see thousands of images of this sort of matrix. Now, whilst it's a bit of a simplistic method, I think it is something that's recognized and understood by a lot of people, and in that sense I think it helps communicate with a broader audience rather than just within one's own particular area of expertise. And the next slide will show an example where this was used on a particular this is a case where we use this approach on a technical audit where there was a joint team of geologists and mining engineers, and we were having multiple people going to multiple sites with this, which were controlled by the same company, and they wanted us to assess the reporting procedures and the reported mineral resources and mineral reserves in their different company operations. And the review focused in particular on, because if you're doing a risk uncertainty assessment, you have to first establish the context you're interested in. In this case, it was issues which could result in a material misstatement of the publicly reported mineral resources or mineral reserves, and in particular trying to identify whether there were any misstatements of the tonnages or grades, or misstatement of the confidence categories. Those are the, like in mineral resources, we talk about inferred, indicated and measured, which are different levels of confidence. That tends to be a bit subjective, but if someone is overconfident, they may put everything in measured and say, well, no further work needs to be done, whereas someone comes along later and says, oh, there's a lot of uncertainty here, you need to do a lot of extra work. So it can affect management decisions. And the results of that project showed very quickly, if you compare that, what's on the screen there, you can see project 2 stands out as having a very different sort of risk profile to the other 2 projects. And in particular, it has far more identified risk uncertainty issues. It has a larger number of information gaps as well. Some issues you find, well, they haven't collected any information. If no geotechnical or hydrogeological studies have been done, you're more or less guessing about those parameters in the project. And they had, in this instance, there were 3 what were regarded as extreme threats. In fact, one of those, or 3 issues. One of those was in fact a threat, one was considered an opportunity, and the other is an area of unacceptable uncertainty. So, but they were highlighted as that. But anyway, moving on to conclusions. Well, on the right here are the items from the current CRIRSCO template, and you'll see that it has split table 1 into multiple sections, the first 9 of which apply to every project, and you'll see the number of rows in the table are summarized there on the right. But I think that the codes and standards could be improved by there's very little actual guidance on uncertainty and risk assessment, even though that's one of the main reasons for having the codes and standards. The number of mentions of risk has gone from 2 in the 2013 template up to 22 in the latest template, but it's perhaps still a little bit limited. And I think also, if we're using table 1, it's not enough just to use it as a summary and put down every item, even if there's some of the codes refer to use it on an if not, why not basis. Well, that's still not obliging the person using it, the competent person, to pull out and make clear to readers who may be investors or management which are the more important risk uncertainty issues, which are the ones really which merit spending more work and money on. And it would also provide a framework for adding extra items for new areas of concern. We've probably heard people talking about modifying factors before. In fact, things like that are buried in technical studies. And, for those perhaps outside the area of doing this work, you'll be surprised, well, there's no specific section on waste management, particularly given that some of the most public issues with mining have been recent tailings dams failures and stuff. There is mention of tailings in there, but it's buried within the technical studies side of things. So perhaps if we want to highlight particular issues or ensure industry pays particular attention to certain topics, then they should have their own entry in the thing. And perhaps to make it easier then for management and investors to compare things, we could have some standard sort of dashboards to display in a visually understandable way how the different profile of different projects are. And so to conclude, hopefully I've left some time for questions, but just to share with you how the name and logo of my company, which I set up the end of 2016, are linked to the topic of uncertainty and risk. And I think, particularly for me, I think often people overlook some areas, there's no information, and they think, oh, well, there's no uncertainty or risk. But if you've got no information, you've got a huge amount of uncertainty, because it can be just tossing a coin to guess what's in that area. And so there we are.
Brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Ed. And a massive round of applause to you from everybody around the world. Now, as per usual, we have a range of questions coming in. And the first one is, you mentioned waste management perhaps being one of those areas that's a little bit buried within what's required from the different codes, etc., and the guidance. Other than waste management, are there any other specific areas of risk that you think might need to be elevated or given a bit more focus?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I tend to come at it from the geological perspective, but it's really what, you know, is what is driving is what are investors and management, and obviously, you know, from the whole point of this conference, the environmental, social, and governance things are there. They are in there, but it's perhaps, you know, we perhaps need a wider discussion of, you know, of what issues people think should be going up. But really from the codes and standards really developed largely from the perspective of geologists and mining engineers. And it's, as I said, it's really to highlight and identify areas where you need to spend more money on. Obviously, permitting these days requires an environmental and impact assessments and so forth to be carried out. So that's part of the project timeline, is making sure baseline studies are done in time. And you know, once again, I think it's useful to have some of these issues in at the early stage, because people often forget. You'll have companies talking, oh, well, we're going to develop this mine in a year's time, and you say, well, how long does it take to complete environmental and baseline studies? And they say, oh, well, that's going to should take at least a year, you know, and then you have to prepare your report and submit them. So I think highlighting things early on, make sure you get them built into the plan for the project development. I would like to say specific issues, but you know, everyone will have their own particular perspective on it.
Yeah, so I guess there's an aspect of managing expectations there as well. Then if you build some of those bits and pieces in earlier on, in terms of preparing people for where there is perhaps more uncertainty that you're seeing up front. So therefore there may be some showstoppers with regards to that project as it progresses to a more mature stage.
Yeah, well, having started my work doing mineral exploration in rural Ireland, what you find out is you're often the first contact with people on the ground when you go and ask for a farmer for permission to drill in their field or whatever. So, you know, if people create tensions with local society early on by just not respecting, you know, farmers, say the simple thing, leaving gates open, you know, like if you're walking through the countryside, you know, you immediately start, because it may come back to something as simple as that early on, that people object to it because of, you know, simple personal interactions on the ground. But in other times, I mean, I've heard other projects where sometimes it's a local business owner is objecting to a mine starting because people would end up having the opportunity to be paid better wages. And, you know, sometimes people have hidden agendas in objecting to projects, which you need to be careful of that as well.
Great, thank you very much, Ed. And there are more questions coming in on both Q&A and YouTube, but I'm just going to go to the question that's sitting here on YouTube for the moment, and that's from Richard. And he asks, Ed, do you find that Table 1 is often used instead of a good technical report rather than supplement to it?
Well, no. Well, I mean, I think the problem is that's essentially the route that JORC took. They said people can do a Table 1 summary rather than, you know, have a commitment to do a full report. When I'm doing training courses, what I tell people is because I usually give them the example of the technical report in Canada, the NI 43-101 technical reports, and I say, I find it easiest, start with Table 1, and you can kind of do a mapping of Table 1 to which sections of an NI 43-101 report they fit into. But if you've kind of got your summary prepared in Table 1, particularly thinking on the importance of uncertainties and risk, it makes it much easier then, because you immediately have, say, highlighted in red the really important ones. So you say, when I'm talking about assay data, I'm going to have to mention the fact that they used an inappropriate analytical method, or they had a highly biased results from the quality control sample. So I don't see the two. I think there was a deliberate decision in Australasia not to impose the requirement for technical reports, you know, formal technical report. What I think the codes would be much better at saying is just impose people to actually use Table 1 or whatever, or the technical reports, but make clearer where the risks and uncertainties. You know, if I'm going to report, I'll look at the executive summary, maybe go to the conclusions, then I try looking where in this report are they talking about the risks and uncertainties. And you know, that's the problem is there's a lot of managers say, well, you know, we don't want to highlight risks and uncertainties, you know, just pretend everything's perfect. I think unfortunately if you do that, then they don't put in any budget to actually properly address the risks and uncertainties. And you know, to me is more important. So I don't see it an either or. I think Table 1 is very good as a kind of checklist and, you know, mental checklist to identify and highlight the items. And then if you've got it completed in a proper manner, it makes it much easier then to write your report at the end, because you just automatically cross-reference with your Table 1.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put together your virtual hands to say thank you very much to the one